What does it mean when the most powerful figure in the United States Senate puts pen to paper on a document that could fundamentally alter the trajectory of American politics? Reports emerging from Capitol Hill suggest that Senate leadership has taken a procedural step that political observers are calling unprecedented in its potential implications. If these accounts prove accurate, we may be witnessing the institutional mechanics of American democracy operating in ways we haven't seen in generations. The whispers in Washington corridors have been building for weeks, but the formal documentation process that allegedly unfolded today represents something far more consequential than the usual political theater. This isn't about cable news sound bites or social media feuds. This is about the constitutional machinery of governance engaging with the kind of precision and gravity that defines truly historic moments. You've probably seen the headlines flashing across your screen, the urgent breaking news alerts, and the wall-to-wall coverage suggesting that something seismic has shifted in the power structure of American politics. But to understand what may have actually transpired, we need to look beyond the immediate shock value and examine the institutional processes that govern how power moves in Washington when the stakes reach their absolute peak. The United States Senate operates according to rules that were designed by the founders to be deliberate, methodical, and resistant to sudden emotional swings. When we talk about official removal procedures, we're discussing mechanisms that require extraordinary majorities, extensive deliberation, and adherence to constitutional protocols that have been tested only a handful of times in American history. According to legal scholars and parliamentary experts, any official removal order would need to navigate a complex web of procedural requirements that make such actions extremely difficult to execute. The threshold for Senate action in matters of this magnitude typically requires a two-thirds majority, which represents 67 senators voting in agreement. This is not a standard that can be achieved through simple partisan politics or temporary political alliances. If reports of signed documentation are accurate, it would suggest that Senate leadership believes they have the institutional support necessary to sustain such an extraordinary measure. Political analysts note that this kind of procedural confidence doesn't emerge overnight. It typically represents the culmination of extensive behind-the-scenes negotiations, vote counting, and strategic coordination among various factions within the chamber. The timing of these reported developments is particularly significant when viewed against the broader political calendar. Constitutional scholars point out that the Senate rarely takes actions of this magnitude without careful consideration of how such moves will be perceived by the public, by the courts, and by future historians who will judge the institution's handling of unprecedented circumstances. To understand the weight of Senate leadership putting their signature on any official document, you have to appreciate the unique position that the Senate Majority Leader occupies within the American system of government. Unlike positions in the executive branch that operate with broad, unilateral authority, the Senate leadership functions more as a conductor of an orchestra where each musician has significant independent power. When reports suggest that Senate leadership has signed off on removal proceedings, we're talking about a figure who has likely spent considerable time ensuring that the institutional infrastructure can support such a dramatic step. This involves not just counting votes, but coordinating with committee chairs, managing the legislative calendar, and ensuring that proper constitutional procedures are followed at every stage. Political observers note that Senate leaders, regardless of party, tend to be extremely cautious about actions that could set dangerous precedents for future Congresses. The decision to move forward with any removal process would represent a calculation that the risk of inaction outweighs the institutional risks of taking extraordinary measures. Legal experts emphasize that the Senate's constitutional role in removal proceedings is fundamentally different from a typical legislative vote. When acting in this capacity, senators are required to take a specific oath, follow judicial-style procedures, and consider evidence according to standards that are closer to a court trial than a political debate. American history provides limited precedents for the kind of Senate action that these reports seem to describe. The impeachment and removal process has been initiated only a handful of times, and successful removals from office remain extraordinarily rare events that tend to reshape political discourse for generations. Constitutional historians point out that when the Senate has acted in removal proceedings in the past, the process has typically been lengthy, deliberative, and marked by extensive public debate. The idea that such proceedings could move rapidly through official documentation suggests either an extraordinary level of institutional consensus or circumstances that political leadership views as requiring immediate action. If confirmed, these developments would represent the Senate asserting its constitutional authority in ways that could significantly alter the balance of power between the legislative and executive branches. Political scientists note that such institutional assertions typically occur during periods of perceived crisis, when traditional political norms have been strained beyond their normal limits. The broader implications for American democracy would depend heavily on how such proceedings are conducted, whether they follow established constitutional procedures, and how the public responds to the Senate exercising what many consider to be its most solemn constitutional responsibility. What makes these reported developments particularly significant is the potential impact on the entire Republican Party infrastructure. If Senate leadership has indeed taken formal steps toward removal proceedings, it would represent a fundamental break with the political loyalties that have defined conservative politics for nearly a decade. Political strategists from both parties acknowledge that any Senate action of this magnitude would create massive ripple effects throughout the political system. Republican senators would face enormous pressure from their bases. Democratic senators would need to navigate the appearance of partisan overreach, and the entire 2024 election landscape could be fundamentally altered. The reported involvement of Senate leadership suggests that institutional Republicans may have concluded that the long-term health of both the party and the constitutional system requires taking dramatic action, regardless of the short-term political costs. This kind of calculation typically only occurs when political leaders believe they are facing an existential threat to democratic governance. Campaign finance experts note that removal proceedings would likely freeze significant portions of political fundraising as donors wait to see how the institutional landscape settles. This could have cascading effects on down-ballot races, state party organizations, and the broader conservative movement ecosystem. The significance of these reported developments extends far beyond the immediate political personalities involved. If accurate, we're witnessing the American constitutional system operating under extraordinary stress, testing mechanisms that the founders designed but hoped would rarely be necessary. For voters trying to make sense of these developments, the key question isn't just about partisan politics or personal loyalties. It's about whether our democratic institutions can function effectively when faced with unprecedented challenges to traditional political norms and constitutional boundaries. The Senate's unique role in American democracy means that any action they take in removal proceedings carries constitutional weight that goes beyond typical political maneuvering. If these reports prove accurate, senators would be acting not just as partisans or party members, but as constitutional officers with specific duties to the institutional integrity of American democracy. The international implications could also be significant, as allies and adversaries around the world watch to see whether American democratic institutions can manage internal crises without compromising the stability that has defined American leadership for decades. Whether these reported developments represent a turning point in American politics or simply another chapter in ongoing institutional tensions remains to be seen. The constitutional processes involved are designed to be deliberative and transparent, which means the public should have opportunities to observe and evaluate how their elected representatives handle these extraordinary responsibilities. The Senate's institutional memory extends back more than 2 centuries, encompassing civil wars, world wars, and numerous constitutional crises. If current leadership has indeed initiated removal proceedings, they are drawing on that institutional experience while facing circumstances that may be unprecedented in their specific details. What happens next will likely depend on factors that extend well beyond the immediate political calculations of individual senators. Constitutional law experts emphasize that removal proceedings, once initiated, tend to follow their own institutional logic, driven more by evidence and constitutional requirements than by typical political considerations. The American people will ultimately judge whether their elected representatives have acted appropriately in exercising the most serious constitutional responsibilities entrusted to the legislative branch. That judgment will shape not just the immediate political landscape, but the precedents that future generations of political leaders will inherit. The story of American democracy has always been one of institutions adapting to extraordinary challenges while maintaining constitutional continuity. If these reports prove accurate, we may be witnessing another chapter in that ongoing story, written by senators who understand that their signatures on official documents carry the weight of constitutional history.